statewide. You guys are part of an awesome network, and we very much admire your work. So I'm Jeff Moore. I'm the Chief Strategy Officer at IS. And as Kevin mentioned, independent sector, we actually, just looking at some records, we were formally created by charter 44 years ago yesterday. We are a national organization representing all the parts and pieces of the nonprofit sector, right? So grant-seeking organizations, grant-making organizations, private philanthropy, corporate social responsibility programs. And I'm going to pause there, let Emily introduce herself, and then I'll ask her to pull up a slide, and we'll take you through a little bit of a tour of the advocacy survey work.
Thanks, Jeff. I'm Emily Rogers. I'm the manager of policy research at Independent Sector. And I had the privilege of being able to work with the academic research team to get this study of nonprofit advocacy out into the field, and then the results out to the public.
Thanks, Emily. And while you're pulling up the slides, I would just remind folks from the outset that this is a long arc piece of work, right? We're not done. So what was released and what we're going to be talking about here, there we go. What we're going to be talking about here are the quantitative findings, which we released last year. We're now in the qualitative interview phase, right? So you're going to see a lot of numbers here. We're now in a process of interviews, qualitative interviews, so that we can get under sort of the why of the numbers. And then at the end of the day, when we conduct research or commission research as independent sector, really what we're trying to get at, the numbers are all important to understand, right? But at the end of the day, what we're trying to do is to change something. So here, what we're trying to do is to understand what is happening to advocacy practice, lobbying practice by nonprofits across the country. The curves, as Kevin suggested, not particularly good news. But then at the end of the day, what do we do to turn the curves in a positive direction? So that's what this work is really aimed toward in the long haul. So why do we pay attention to advocacy? For each one of us that's sitting on this call, right, as a member of the nonprofit community, at some level, we are all focused on making sure that all people living in this country are thriving and that they are thriving in a flourishing democracy. In one way, shape, or form, we all kind of touch that very aspirational mission, right, or aspirational aim, and that is certainly true for IS. So what we know is in order to get to that place, right, we believe that we must have a nonprofit sector that is healthy, that is trusted, and that is equitable. It's kind of a necessary precondition. You got to have a healthy, trusted, equitable sector to get to that place that I just described. And so then to take it one last layer down, when we talk about healthy, what do we really mean? And we as independent sector, we look at 4 aspects of health, right? We want nonprofit organizations that are financially robust. We want nonprofit organizations that are powered by a healthy workforce, human capital. We want organizations that are trusted and governing themselves well. And we want nonprofit organizations that are informed and active advocates. The last time a study had been done on nonprofit advocacy was actually in 2000. So we were looking at about a 22, 23-year gap in our knowledge as to how healthy we are in this particular dimension. So that's why we stepped into the work. Emily, we can go to the next slide. For those who pay attention, as you always should, when we're talking about research, to the methodology, right? This was a nationally representative survey. We don't do the research on our own. We typically commission others to do it. And you see at the bottom here, the very reputable research partners that we brought into the effort. The survey was in the field from July 2022 to December 2022. And you see the number of surveys completed here. So this is considered a number one, statistically significant survey and weighted to be representative of the entire sector. And the first one in 23 years. Thanks, Emily. So important to keep in mind, right, because we're talking about advocacy and lobbying rates. We did have definitions, and these slides will be available to you as part of the recorded session. And we can make them available as well, Kevin, in hard copy form if you want to circulate them. But these we did define for purpose of taking the survey. Here's what lobbying is. Here's what policy advocacy is. So folks had some sense of what we were trying to get at. You can read this later. So a lot of key findings, and Emily is going to dive more deeply into some of them. I'm not going to talk to every one of these on the page, but I am going to call out several. So top left-hand corner, 31%, right? So in 2000, at the time of the last survey, roughly 70% of nonprofits indicated that they were somehow engaged in advocacy or lobbying. 23 years later, half of that, less than half of that rate of nonprofits actively engaged in advocating or lobbying, 31%. So the curve is very much going in the wrong direction. I'm going to jump over to the top right corner, the 32% number. So nonprofits have a fairly good sense of what they can't do, but they really don't understand what they can do. So again, this gets at the complexity of the rules, right? There have to be rules. We understand that as nonprofits, right? There have to be rules that govern the way in which we engage in public policy advocacy. We do hold a privileged tax advantage as organization. And so we have to comply with rules, but the rules are particularly complicated, and it continues, that complexity continues to bring a chilling effect to advocacy rates across the sector. Then I'm going to jump down to the lower left corner as you're looking at the slide, that 13% number. Right. So one of the ways in which we engage our communities, right, and we engage in public policy work is through nonpartisan voter engagement. Only 13% of organizations are actively engaged in nonpartisan voter engagement. And that can be everything from running voter registration, getting people to the polls, candidate forums. That is an abysmally low number. So when you start to look at these numbers, especially the three that I just called out, and there is some good news on here, I will call that out in a moment. But just think about it. We are leaving an incredible amount of our power as the nonprofit sector on the table. The last thing I will mention is the positive numbers. So the 57% number, right? It is really intriguing and encouraging to learn through this survey work that in fact, 57% of nonprofits that belong to some kind of a coalition, they collaborate with others who engage in advocacy. That number is actually quite strong. So there is something about the power of working in coalition that we shouldn't be ignoring. So I'm going to stop there, and I'm going to turn to Emily to drive through some more interesting learnings, and then we'll have time for questions at the back end of the conversation.
Thanks, Jeff. So Jeff mentioned He touched on this, the 31% of nonprofits that report engaging lobbying or advocacy in the last 5 years, which is, again, significantly less than was measured 20 years ago. He also mentioned that nonprofits have a pretty good idea of what they can't do. You'll see the first and the third lines. The blue bar outpaces the gray bar a little bit, but unfortunately, the remainder of these, there is a stark contrast between the blue, which is the 2022 survey, and the gray, which is the 2000 survey. So this was a quiz that was administered in both surveys. And then the last two were new questions. So we created some new benchmarks moving forward. We also compared the frequency of different types of policy participation from the 2000 SNAP survey to the 2022 Penn survey. And across the board, they are lower in all of them. But I wanted to just flag two of these, discussing obtaining grants or contracts with government officials, and then meeting with government officials about the work we are doing. Again, the instances of these as never being done or being done at a low rate are higher now than they were in the year 2000. And these are two examples that I think really speak to the connection between advocacy and nonprofit missions. So of that 31% that did report advocating or lobbying in the last 5 years, what do we know about them? Well, we know that it varies by subsector. Environmental organizations make up about 5% of nonprofit organizations, but they're really punching above their weight, with 43% of them engaging in advocacy or lobbying. And human services organizations make up a little over a third of the sector, and only 32% of them are engaging in advocacy or lobbying. Budget size is strongly correlated with whether engages in advocacy or lobbying, with organizations that have larger budgets, particularly those of 10 million and above, being far more likely to engage than those with smaller budget. Really less than 100,000, it's down to 17%. The research team coded states based on the 2020 Cook Political Index as red, blue, or purple. And nonprofits in blue states are advocating at a rate of about 34%, purple states 27%, and red states 29%. They hypothesize that purple states are the lowest because people really don't want to step on anyone's toes, so they're a bit more hesitant. And then when we look at geographic scope of programs, organizations that operate within a state or regionally within a state are more likely to advocate than organizations operating locally, nationally, or internationally. So I think you all as a state organization are kind of ahead of that curve. I do want to flag that local organizations, which make up about nearly half of the sector, are advocating at the lowest rates outside of international organizations. So when we're looking at advocacy or lobbying across community characteristics where organizations are located, organizations located in low-income areas or primarily in communities of color are more likely to advocate than those that are not located in those areas. Additionally, organizations located in urban core areas are more likely to advocate than those located in rural or suburban areas. And it's important to understand that a little over half of the sector is located in suburban areas, and they have the lowest rate of advocacy. So revenue sources are also likely tied to advocacy and lobbying engagement. Organizations that receive government grants or contracts are much more likely to be policy participators than those that don't. And interestingly, organizations that are less likely to participate in policy or advocacy rely more on individual donations for their programming. So now that we've learned a bit about, what are the characteristics of these organizations that are engaging in lobbying or advocacy, wanted to dig into, what motivates them or discourages them from engaging. So as Jeff mentioned at the top of the call, the mission is the strongest motivator for or against engaging in advocacy. If a nonprofit perceives that that advocacy is something that can help them achieve their mission, they are far more likely to engage. In terms of discouraging factors, tax laws or IRS rules are discouraging, and organizational capacities are discouraging. And both of those are consistent across all organization sizes and nearly all subsectors. One of the things we wanted to measure was whether or not policy and advocacy engagement impacted other types of public engagement. So social movement activity, which is defined as activities that broadly engage in moving particular social issues forward, and then civic engagement, which is more around things like voting. So they found that, yes, if an organization is engaging in policy or advocacy, they are most likely engaging in social movement activity or civic engagement activity. Particularly striking is the rate at which organizations that do engage in lobbying and advocacy also engage in social movement activity. I mean, the difference between the blue and the dark blue bar is pretty striking there. And we think that these are probably mutually reinforcing, so that if an organization is engaging in civic engagement activities, that would also probably increase their likelihood to engage in policy or advocacy activities. We dove into nonpartisan elections engagement, and Jeff mentioned that only about 13% of nonprofits are conducting nonpartisan activities to help people vote. We did a breakdown of what those activities are. Voter education and get out the vote efforts are the ones that are used the most often. When we look at characteristics of nonprofits that do engage in elections work, we see that organizations that are located in low income communities are more likely to engage in elections work than other organizations. It's also interesting, it's not on this slide, but organizations that have programs that focus on immigrants are more likely to engage in elections engagement. And then organizations that broadly have programs that focus on people of color in general are also more likely to engage. And all three of those, most of their engagement is around get out the vote efforts. So you can see that the POC-focused organizations, 21.2% of them are engaging in elections work, and then immigrant-focused organizations, about a little over a quarter of them are engaging. So this, taken together, this shows us that nonprofits can play a very important role in elections engagement, particularly among marginalized and underserved communities. It's just that it doesn't seem to be very many nonprofits that are engaging in that type of work. We also looked at policy engagement and DEI commitment. So an organization's commitment to DEI may be one of the factors that drives its policy engagement. In fact, we think these are probably mutually reinforcing and bidirectional. But I think it's important to note that nonprofits, 63% of nonprofits have a DEI statement, so almost 2/3 of the sector. But only 36% of those are engaging in lobbying or advocacy to create more equitable systems. So the bright spot of coalitions. So nonprofits that belong to coalitions are more likely to engage in lobbying and advocacy as opposed to nonprofits that are not members of coalitions. And when we talk about coalitions, it's broadly defined as associations like the Tennessee Nonprofit Network, informal groups that come together to provide services or reach an end goal, or formal kind of issue-based coalitions like the Charitable Giving Coalition. So characteristics of coalition members, what organizations are members of coalitions? I think it's really interesting that about half of coalition membership organizations have budgets less than 500,000, with about a third of those being less than 100,000. So you have smaller organizations that are participating. In terms of subsector, human services at about 40% of coalition members is the biggest subsector represented. And a lot of the others kind of hover around like, 9 to 12. And then the smallest being international organizations, which we expected. So why do nonprofits participate in coalitions? When we asked, they said that there were two big reasons why nonprofits wanted to participate. They wanted to engage in issues, policy or legislative issues that impact the communities they serve, and then ones that impact their organization's operations. So when we look at kind of how frequently people are engaging with coalitions, coalition engagement does not crowd out other advocacy engagement. So they engage at a higher rate on their own than those who are not members of coalitions. So it's not like if you belong to a coalition that's replacing all the advocacy you do. It's actually probably encouraging you to do more advocacy outside of that coalition. So I wanted to kind of drill down as much as I could for you all. And the closest I can get is kind of a breakout of Southern states. So the states pictured in this image here, including Tennessee, the average rate of advocacy or lobbying engagement for these states is about 27%, which is below the national average of 30%. And then you can see, like, when we drill down into kind of specific elections engagement, it's also slightly below the national average. And I'd like to hand things back over to Jeff.
Thanks, Emily. I know we're driving a lot of or throwing a lot of information at you, and we're just about at the end, and we'll pause for questions. So I want to reflect on a couple of things that Emily spent a little bit of time on, right? So the DEI example is one that's always been really very interesting to me. So I think Emily, remind me if the numbers are right here, but that the survey found that roughly 63% of surveyed nonprofits held some kind of a point of view and maybe even had a policy or did specifically have a policy on DEI, but less than half of them actually advocate. So, it makes me kind of scratch my head when I think about, well, look, the changes that we look to see in the world, whether we're talking specifically about race equity changes or other systemic changes, we know we're preaching to the choir, they don't just happen, right? Those things don't just happen. They take our voices, right? And your Tennessee Nonprofit Network team talked about that at the front end of this conversation, right? It takes your voice. So it's just interesting to me that there is this real disconnect that is, I think, deeply concerning. So what do we need to do? I said at the end of the open of the conversation, right, that when we commission research like this, we're always trying to get to the, okay, so what do we do about this? The data is, rich, and we can spend a lot of time sort of diving into the data. But at the end of the day, how do we move forward? So we are thinking as independent sector in kind of three big buckets around what is required for us to turn these curves. The first is, we've got this little mantra here: rules, tools, and money, right? So the first is we continue to believe and have long advocated around the fact that the rules around how nonprofits engage need to be clarified. They need to exist. They don't have to be as complicated as they are. And so we have been for a long time working with a project called the Bright Lines Project, which seeks to actually promulgate new rules that would make it easier to understand that not only what I cannot do, but what I can do. And that is work that we continue to press on. It is very sensitive work. It's very politically charged work, especially at this moment in Washington, D.C. But we continue to believe that rules changes, rules improvements are really needed. I'm going to jump over the tools for a moment, and I'm going to come to the money. So as we were conducting this work, right, we heard from countless nonprofits, specifically on the question of voter engagement, right? They're telling us, and these are small community-based organizations, telling us, look, you don't need to tell us that it is important for us to engage our communities, our core constituency around elections and the importance of voting and making sure that candidates' positions are well understood in the appropriate way. This is in our DNA. We know how to do it, and we know why it's so important. But until such time as funders actually start to make it possible for me to do this work and not just have to suck it up as one more cost, I can't do the work. So there is a body of work that is sorely needed for us to help philanthropy understand how important this work is and how important it is that they step into the work in a way that encourages their grantees to engage, consistent with the rules, but to engage. And then finally, the tools. This is where, things like advocacy training and actually spending time putting resources out into the world, in addition to some resources that are out there that are great, like from Boulder Advocacy, for instance. But how is it that you do this work? What can you say and what can you not say? What in fact is lobbying, and how do you draw those lines as they relate to your organization? So this is the work that is in front of us, and IS doesn't hold this work alone. We all hold this work. So then the last thing, and admittedly, this is going to be a little bit of a shameless invitation. I want to come back to the point around coalitions. Undoubtedly, y'all, as being a part of a state association, you're part of a coalition, right? We would certainly invite you as independent sector to also consider joining the Nonprofit Infrastructure Coalition. This is a coalition that we lead with Kaboom. I don't know if you all are familiar with Kaboom. An incredible organization. Their mission, in a couple of words, is basically to end play space inequities. They mobilize volunteers around the country to build playgrounds in underserved communities. The Nonprofit Infrastructure Coalition, and you do not need to be an IS member to join it. There is no fee. It is an opportunity for you to come together with about 70 or so other organizations from around the country to really focus on the federal level policies that are needed to make sure that indeed we have a sector that is healthy, is trusted, and is equitable. And if you have any more questions about that, happy to answer them later or send you to our website or give us a call, and we'd be happy to. Rhonda Jackson, my Kaboom partner, and I would be happy to talk with you about joining the coalition. We meet virtually once a month. So I think that brings us to the end of the conversation, and happy to take any questions that you all might have, either questions of clarification or Sort of, so what questions or points of debate?
Y'all feel free to put your questions in the chat. You can also just unmute yourself. We have a smaller group, so it makes it a little easier. I do have a question for you, Jeff. And Emily, one thing that we've experienced is a lot of nonprofits are the executive directors, the staff, they're ready to advocate on behalf of their missions. Their board members are not. The board members, especially CPAs and lawyers, those folks are often the most, they're the hardest to get on board. Did that show up in the research at all? Do y'all have anything to add about that? Because that keeps showing up, and we're facing that challenge every day, it seems.
Emily, do you want to speak to the extent to which that was addressed in the research? It certainly, we see the same thing, but Emily, please go ahead.
Sure. Yes, when we looked at those motivating and discouraging factors, one of them was our organization's attitudes towards local, state, or federal policy decisions, and organizations' attitudes towards advocacy. Interestingly, these were both more motivating than they were discouraging. But we are currently doing a series of qualitative interviews that seek to kind of go in deeper and answer these questions. And I think hopefully we'll be able to kind of address where in organizations they're running up against those barriers after that research is completed.
Kevin, I mean, to the point, right? And just sort of historically and anecdotally, I mean, we continue to see very much the same things. Boards, by definition, right? Boards are there to keep organizations safe. They have fiduciary responsibilities, legal responsibilities for organizations. They often tend to err on the more conservative side. And there are entire organizations, Board Source being a good example, that are dedicated to trying to change those curves with boards, right? There's a program through Board Source called Stand With Your Mission that was all about trying to train board members or to retrain board members in their thinking about policy advocacy. It continues to be uphill work. Question around advocacy efforts and whether or not it could have impact on funding. So Emily, again, do you want to speak from a research perspective, and then I can speak from a, kind of what we see in the practice?
Sure. I think this question makes a lot of sense. It's something we've heard anecdotally as well. When we examined kind of the relationship between funding and engaging in advocacy, a lot of organizations that are policy participators do receive government funding and corporate or foundation grants. And kind of against what we expected, more organizations that do not participate in policy or advocacy rely more on individual donations. So sadly, I don't have a good answer for you there, but we do have a white paper coming out in the next month that dives deeper onto this data. The research team is putting it together. So I think in the next month or so, we will have more information we can share on the specific relationships between funding and advocacy.
And again, not sharing anything that you all haven't either heard or encountered directly, right? Just sort of stating the obvious that to my earlier point around the responsibility that funders have to, we all love our funders, right? And we need our funders, but we also need our funders to get a little bit, I'm going to use the word smarter, but for them to think maybe in some new ways about how they encourage their grantees to step appropriately into this work. And one of the things that we know continues, I talked earlier about chilling effect, right? We still see grant language, right? in our own organization and hear about it from other organizations, grant language that is really, really strident in placing responsibility on the grantee not to engage, right? And so lots of foundations, in fairness, have done a tremendous job in rethinking how they put grant agreements together, right? But not everybody has. So there's more work that needs to be done. Do you have any thoughts on how to move the needle in state Tennessee care reimbursements? We're operating at the same rate from 1998. So I'm not sure I know how to answer the question. So 10 care reimbursements are, please help us understand what 10 care is.
And
Hey,
Jeff,
Natalie Jones, I think we need to get in contact with N. Whitman to learn more about that, because that definitely sounds like something that needs to be on our radar.
Yes, so we can, so for Medicare, so 10 Care is our state Medicare program,
Yep.
and might include some Medicaid funding as well, but
Got
we
it.
can definitely get in contact and follow up. Oh, it's Medicaid, not Medicare. Perfect. Thank you for the clarification. Get around with that because there are some different ways, but that's generally more of a federal reimbursement issue than state advocacy work. So
Right. Other questions or things that you all would like to know that you didn't hear in the course of this presentation? We didn't give you everything, but we gave you a lot. And maybe even more importantly, you know, as we make this pivot later this year and into next year, thinking about okay, so now what do we do? What are the tools, the interventions that are most needed by the sector to turn these curves? Any advice for us? We are going to be bringing together an advisory panel. We'll have more information about that later in the year. There might be an opportunity for some of you to participate, to think about what is most needed sort of in the way of practical tools. But would love, if there's something that immediately comes to mind, would love to hear that from you all. Thoughts?